Hello and welcome to another edition of hippoBrain. Here is where we have hippo-sized conversations with people with hippo-sized brains. It's amazing that we get all these crazy, beautiful hippo-sized brains, guys, on our show, and we have these varied list of conversations with them. Today, I'm extremely excited because till some time back, I didn't really know that there is something called somebody who covers the political economy of the country. And I did have a chance to go through some of the books that he's written. He's a prolific author. And I can only tell you one thing. I'm looking forward to this conversation. It will hopefully shed a lot of answers and a lot of light into some of the questions that I have about what. Rajesh, over to you to explain a little bit more about our guest for the show.
Thank you, Jaimit. Our guest today is Shankkar Aiyar. Welcome to hippoBrain, Shankkar.
Thank you, Rajesh. Pleasure.
I've known Shankkar for many years, and every conversation with him is a veritable delight. If you've not read, please Google him. He writes regularly in the New Indian Express and pays special attention to the titles of his columns. Bloomberg Quint, very well researched articles full of numbers and very methodically argued points. But today what we are going to do is focus on the three books that Shankkar has written. And in a way, they tell the story of India. The first book, Accidental India, basically talks about how India changes, or the reforms that happens in India, essentially only in a crisis. So we'll cover that first. Then the second one is about one of the biggest tech revolutions in India, Aadhaar. Shankkar's book, second book, really goes into the full Aadhaar story. And the third book, which came out this year, you can also see at the back there, The Gated Republic, talks about how, in a way, taking the story further, how governments in India have basically failed to create the public solutions, the public infrastructure in multiple areas, whether it's education, health, water, security, etc. So why has that happened? And what can we look forward ahead? And finally, we'll spend a little time towards the end talking on what Shankkar's ideas are on the next economy. So that's a great sort of a conversation, I think, to look forward to. Shankkar's background, of course, has been amazing. By the way, for people who will not remember, and something which happened 30 years ago, Shankkar broke the story in 1991 about RBI pledging gold to essentially save the Indian economy. And that really kickstarted the era of Indian liberalization. That's our guest today, Shankkar. So Shankkar, let's start with the first book, Accidental India. I think the core premise really is around crisis leads to change. Why is that so in India?
So this question I had when I broke the story of RBI pledging its gold reserves for a mere $400 million. I mean, that's all we needed at that time. And we had just a week's foreign exchange reserves in the system. So when I saw the gold trunk, the RBI trunks being loaded into the cargo aircraft and all, this question was in my head that, I mean, is this the best that a country can do? I mean, why does it have to wait till this? It's like, even families do better in terms of, so, but over a period of writing on the political economy, so for some reason, for some reason or the other, my focus, I shifted cities, I shifted publications, but my focus stayed on one thing as to how politics affects the economics of people. So this was my area of interest. In fact, people who live in Mumbai may remember about 35 years or 34 years back, I wrote a cover story in one of the city magazines on what happens to every rupee that people pay the Bombay Municipal Corporation. And 63 paisa out of rupee was being spent on themselves. And that was my kind of interest. I was 25 years old and I sort of went into the innards of the BMC to see over a period of time. So to come back to why the crisis thing, this kept haunting me in a sense. And every time I wrote about power reforms or financial sector reforms, you found that um, change always came only in the wake of a crisis. So sometime in 2010 or 11, I decided that it also hit me that this was 2011, when the policy paralysis and all the UPA drama was going on. So it also struck me that, and this is another of my maxims, which is, for things to get better, they must get worse. That is the Indian baseline. So I said, okay, let's look at this. Why does this happen? And I sort of went through the different transformative moments. And to me, the 7 big changes, all of them came at the intersection of politics and economics. I mean, they might have been driven by politics, but they were economic. For instance, bank nationalization. So India always had a challenge of putting together this. I mean, what is the challenge before any system is to get all the savings of all the people and redeploy them at different rates of returns across domains, depending on risk profiles, whether government, private, whatever, for economic growth. So that was not happening, and it's still a challenge, actually. I mean, I don't think India's banks have successfully harnessed what are the level of saving in the system. And you still have a large part of the cash economy because of various reasons of access, affordability, trust, and all those issues. So if you look at the 7 changes, Rajesh, I mean, we spoke about liberalization. I mean, the reason the RBI had to pledge its gold reserves was because when Chandrasekhar was prime minister in January, India went and sought a bailout from IMF. The IMF board said, okay, this is what is required, but what is India doing? What's its equity in the game? How does it have skin in the game? Because you go on doing license Raj and all those stuff. So a lot of people think that Manmohan Singh was the author of the reforms, which is not true. The real author, there are 2 people I would credit. First, the process of enabling reforms, I give full credit to P.V. Narasimha Rao. So when we say that license Raj was dismantled, there's a very interesting story behind that. So Amarnath Verma and Rakesh Mohan. Dr. Rakesh Mohan is now teaching at Yale. He used to be deputy governor and the finance minister, And Amarnath Verma, principal secretary to prime minister. So Amarnath Verma was in the industries ministry when VP Singh was industries secretary when VP Singh was prime minister. And Amarnath Verma and Rakesh Mohan put together a note on what needs to be done for making Indian industry more efficient, more productive. And so the theory that India's license Raj was failing and will fail had been proved as early in the late 60s by Rajaji. There is a very famous manifesto of the Swaraj Party, which says a lot of these issues, which brings out the issues that were holding back India. I mean,
Swatantra Party.
Holding Swatantra Party manifesto. And holding back is putting it mildly. In the 70s, Malawi was growing faster than India. So Amarnath Verma and Rakesh Mohan put together this model new industrial policy paper. And Ajit Singh, who had just come back from IBM at that time, was the industries minister in VP Singh's government. So he was interested in doing these things. And so he presented this idea to VP Singh. And it didn't even reach the parliament. I mean, it got scuttled just right there. And you must remember, VP Singh was supported on the left by the left parties, on the right by BJP. Neither of the parties had any credentials of any reforms. I mean, the BJP had been opposing GATT and the Uruguay round forever, and The left parties, we know, I mean, their policy on, anything that is not owned or controlled by government is an anathema to them. So that the paper never went anywhere. But in January 1991, when we went and met the IMF board, when they asked, what do you have to show us? They produced this junked paper as a testimony of intent that this will be our new industrial policy. And then the IMF cleared the money. And then when Narasimha Rao became Prime Minister, Naresh Chandra, who was the cabinet secretary, gave him 3 pieces of document. One is the bailout agreement with IMF. Second was this liberalization of the industrial sector. And third, exactly where we stood on foreign exchange reserves and what needed to be done. So Mr. Rao, when he was anointed as the Prime Minister, his bedside reading on day one was all these 3 crisis papers, and then he propelled it. And so it was the same thing happened in bank nationalization. The Congress party was about to split, so Mrs. Gandhi leveraged bank nationalization to prove herself to be more socialist, more pro-poor than the other faction of the Congress. So you look at, we are also proud about the milk revolution and Amul and everything, but Verghese Kurian struggled for over 20 years, 25 years actually, before the country paid attention to what needed to be done. And that revolution, the formation of the National Dairy Development Board and the National Milk Grid again came in the wake of a crisis. If you look at the software revolution, now if you go and land in any country in the world, the immigration guys assume that you're a techie like you, Rajesh. So, and they sort of make this gesture, with the keyboard gesture that they do. And this wouldn't have happened again if we didn't have the foreign exchange crisis. And one man, Nagaraj Vittal, who was the electronics secretary, produced a model that worked for tech companies. Similarly, the right to information again came as an accident. So the idea behind Accidental India was that all these transformations came in the wake of crisis. And India's migration from abject penury, which is poverty, to potential of prosperity was serendipitous and therefore accidental India. And to me, even today, the story continues. I mean, as soon as COVID happened, a lot of people wrote to me, particularly on social media, saying, okay, so what's the next accident, And so we've seen some of that stuff happening. If you see the new labor code movement towards freeing of the farm markets, these are riding again on crisis. And we can talk about more. I mean, why that farm reforms thing is critical at this juncture, or why easing of FDI is critical at this juncture.
So, Shankkar, when I hear you and I understand what you're saying, so obviously a politician's good old adage goes that never waste a good crisis. And it probably, I just want to understand, in your opinion, is it that we all know about what needs to get done and politicians also know what needs to get done? It's only that we've had different hippoBrains on the conversation who explained to us that every time you take a certain step, there are counter forces that get affected, and they come and block and say, hey, but what about this? But what about this? Like Akhilesh, who's one of who's the USD for the aviation ministry, was explaining that a simple rerouting of certain planes has a ripple effect of somebody getting affected. So time is your best friend, and crisis allows a politician to break through all the criticism and do what he actually thinks is right. So there are 2 ways to look at it. One, politicians are sitting on their butt, not knowing what happens, and crisis hits them on the face and suddenly they want to do something. Or is it, in your opinion, that they know what is happening, but the time, and given the nature of the political climate, it only happens when the winds are all blowing in certain direction? One obviously gives them more credit and one takes away. What is your opinion of that?
So let's let's separate the two parts to this. I think politicians are far smarter than people give them credit for. I mean, you don't want to deal with 10 million voters and representative deal with 24-hour day schedules unless you're smart and you have some game plan. So politicians are way smarter than most people. Okay, it may not be. Now, one cannot compare a particular politician with a particular smart set guy, but politicians are smart about their interests. So the way to look at this is politicians are entrepreneurs. They're entrepreneurs who are investing their effort, their political capital for electoral dividends. So once you have that alignment in here, then you can assess a lot of the stuff that happens. So the politician, when a crisis happens, decides also to whether to go left or right. I mean, there are ways to deal with a crisis. So the change that they push depends on the documentation that is already existing. So all these issues are being discussed in government. There's nothing that's happening in India is unknown. None of the solutions are unknown. So I always say this when I speak abroad, they say, oh, but crisis propels change everywhere else. So what's unique about India? So I said, the thing that's unique about India is that we have the unique ability to stare simultaneously at the problem and the solution and wait for the crisis. This is our specialty. We just wait for it. So what does a crisis do? Crisis wrenches away choice. It takes away choice. And so the politician gets to leverage crisis as a no option circumstance and then do the change that he wants to do or she wants to do. Crisis also brings into the people's mind this whole aspect that something needs to be done. We can't go on like that. Business for usual nahi chalega, So, and we have globalized the phrase chalta hai. So, whenever we have a crisis, that phrase chalta hai it gets demonetized, So we have to push for some action. And I think the smarter politicians know what needs to be done and they try and time it to do something. I think your point is very right that it's very rare that a politician doesn't know. I mean, there are unknown unknowns. Okay. Now, if you look at, and we can speak about this in great detail, but it's not that it was unknown to India's states and state government and the central government that we had a pretty ruined healthcare system. We didn't need COVID to tell us that. But COVID sort of amplified the lack of healthcare system, the number of beds, doctors, and staff. Still, it is to credit to India's ingenuity that we are able to deal with episodes. So I always say that India does very well in episodic crisis. We do very well in launching a satellite, Mars mission. We do very well in Kumbh Mela and stuff. And I'll come back to this when we talk about the third book. But I have this theory that India is a live miracle in operation.
So, Shankkar, one example of something significant which got done without a crisis is the story in your second book, which is Aadhaar. Aadhaar is an example of someone proactively envisioning a new future and going and making it happen. How did that go? How did that come about?
So there are three aspects to India's public policy. One, change happens in the wake of a crisis. Sometimes change can happen without a crisis, which is Aadhaar. And there are situations where despite crisis, change doesn't happen. So if you look at Aadhaar, it was very apparent. So India had two different issues. One, to aggregate the savings to deliver public services. And people were not opening accounts. We had like an unbanked population, which was 40% of total population. So the other aspect, we were delivering welfare without knowing whether it was reaching the person it was meant to reach. So, I mean, we have the world's largest national food security act, the food security program, the world's largest midday meal scheme, the world's largest children, the child development scheme. And these have been there for like 10, 15, 25 years. I mean, ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Service, has been there from the 70s. We still have the largest amount of malnutrition, stunting, and everything. And there's one about the scale and the other about the delivery mechanism, whether it's reaching, not reaching. So these monies were not reaching. And this was a concern that was there during Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government. It was also a concern that was brought up by the left parties. The CPM actually said that, it's not, so when the UPA was formed, its outside support, the party which backed it with 60 plus seats was the Communist Party Marxist. So there, one of the conditions was that we want welfare to be expanded, we want welfare to be delivered. And this was there in Manmohan Singh's mind for some time. So that typically in government, to assuage an ally, you form a committee of secretaries. Then the committee of secretaries forms a core committee, and the core committee goes into thing. And initially the committee was headed by Arvind Virmani, who put together some paper and nothing more. And there were issues. So India always had three issues. One, it didn't have any concept of what a national identity is. So even today, you cannot define citizenship. There are cases in Supreme Court and High Court where a judge has said that even possession of a passport is not necessarily an proof of your being a citizen. So that's one. So national identity card was a project which started in 2000 and never got anywhere, because it came after the Kargil episode and the parliament attacks that we needed one. And this is an issue that a lot of countries struggle with, not just India, defining citizenship. If people who follow the Trump circus would have noticed that a few days back, he said that people who were not even American, they couldn't prove citizenship, they were voting. Okay. And a few days back, there was a government official in Bihar who complained that people from Nepal were carrying Aadhaar cards and this was a security risk. Neither of them, nobody has yet figured out what Aadhaar is. They all, so because we didn't have a national identity card, everybody thinks Aadhaar. So what's Aadhaar? Aadhaar gave a person who lives in India, not necessarily a citizen, not necessarily a voter, not a document to validate that he is who he says he is, or she is who she says he is. Now, what that document did was that it opened up the doors to access services. And this project, I must say, could never have happened without serendipity that brought Ram Sevak Sharma, who was an IAS officer with a very interesting background, and Nandan Nilekani, who at times I tell him that he passes through a messiah complex every now and then. He wants to do things. So Nandan in 2000, 2008 had written a book, Imagine India. And one of the things that he had written about was this issue of identity to access services. So in 2009, Manmohan Singh was informed by Rahul Gandhi that he wanted Nandan Nilekani in the government and he wanted Nandan as the Human Resource Development Minister. Now, HRD previously was held by Arjun Singh. There was no way the Congress party was going to yield that heavy a post for somebody who was coming from outside politics. And as usual, the pushback was there, and Nandan, who was asked to fly to Delhi for a swearing in, booked a plane, but then was told that, okay, wait, things have not happened as yet. And in the next few days, he met Manmohan Singh, and Manmohan Singh offered him a membership in the Planning Commission, which was, you could do a lot of things if you were N.K. Singh, but, you could just be a member of the Rotary Club if you were not smart about it. So he said, no, I want to do something. So there was this project, the group of ministers headed by Pranab Mukherjee had cleared this idea of an identity card for accessing services. So how to implement this project? And I don't think, I mean, this is how this got implemented at the lowest cost, the structures that were, I mean, so government of India didn't do anything. I mean, they didn't say we will print the cards, we will do the thing. They created a network like an Amul network, of private participants who did the work and they registered and all. And it went through all kinds of opposition, all kinds of drama. And so for me, it was fascinating to write as to how two different political parties, the Congress and the BJP, come to realize that this is a godsend, that we needed Aadhaar. And the politics behind it, it was opposed from within the Congress, and the BJP campaigned against it in the election. Prime Minister Modi called it a gimmick and stuff. And then, I mean, I have this thing about politics, where you stand depends on where you sit. So once you are in the treasury benches, once you're in the ruling party, you are for reforms, you propose every reform. But once you are in the opposition, you go and oppose the very same reforms that you have proposed. I'm still waiting. I mean, Rajesh, this is my dream, that a party in power proposes a particular reform, then gets voted out. Then once in opposition, they oppose the very reform they had passed. I'm just waiting for that to happen. I mean, you pass a law and then you come out in opposition. And I mean, Sukhbir Singh Badal and the Akali Dals have come close to that in the farm reforms thing. They signed off on the ordinance to reform the laws. They were part of the cabinet which took the decision, and they came out and said, "Oh, we opposed it." So I don't know how do you do that, but so it's a brilliant private public partnership. And I must say, the personalities of Ram Sevak Sharma and Nandan Nilekani were in perfect sync for executing this project. This project has been studied the world over. People in the World Bank, people in UN, everywhere. This is an idea that has been adopted, and now India Stack and Nandan's, which is Nandan's initiative, public philanthropic initiative, has put together an open source thing that countries will. And look at this, we have Aadhaar, and so when the vaccines come tomorrow, we have no concern on how we'll deliver it, because we have a digital intelligent network now. So, we always, I mean, India is one of the biggest vaccine producers and vaccine users for polio and other stuff. So we always had a vaccine intelligence network. So what Dr. Harshvardhan, was the health minister, then the government came together. And again, Ram Sevak Sharma went and made the presentation, government consulted Nandan Nilekani. And so the vaccine distribution and allocation program is also both of these people had a role in that. So what did they do? They said that we will expand this vaccine intelligence network. So the government knows where the vaccine has come from, where it is stored, where it is being sent, which is the doctor who's giving it, who is the person who is receiving it. And the person who receives it gets logged on Aadhaar. So this person has got. And so there is a validation, a certification method, everything. And I can say this, and it might sound kind of futuristic, but there will be a time when almost every country, given the state of cybersecurity and the issues that are happening, will go and opt for a biometric identity system. And this is going to be. So yesterday and day before, there was a hack, which people know, Gmail went down, government departments in the US went down. So this morning, and this is why I got a little bit late, because I was tracking that what actually happened. And apparently, this is the allegation, that Russian hackers or hackers in Russia, however you describe this, tapped into a solar and wind farm distribution point and hacked into the US system. They entered the defense department, they entered the health department, they entered two other critical departments which the US government has not named. A few days earlier, hackers had entered the Pfizer server on their clinical trial data. So there is one that is at the commercial level, the cybersecurity issues. The second is personal identity issues. Every year, so countries will need to find ways to distribute relief and identify that, and identification of who should get that relief will require identity systems. I think Aadhaar, and when I gave the title of the book, A Biometric History of India's 12-Digit Revolution, my publishers asked me, how are you so confident that it will be a revolution? I said, if it isn't, it will be a complete dud. But I am very confident that it will be a revolution, and we just have to work this through. We have to be smart about it. We should, and so all the pieces have fallen through. So there we have a privacy judgment, but we don't have a data protection law as yet, which is necessary for any digital initiative. Similarly, we can now use it. I mean, imagine, in the earlier days, if you went to get a telephone connection, you would wait 3 days, call up whether you've been identified, validated, blah, 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 all that. Then you went to open a bank account, you carried 10 things. Now, this one piece of document allows you to do all of those things, and there is so much trust built around it.
So, Shankkar, what you're saying is very interesting in sense of all of this is extremely necessary, but probably also on the other side, you're raising safeguard issues, etc., and data privacy and data regulation. I think while there are many numerous benefits of Aadhaar, some of the criticism that I don't know if you can address very shortly before we move on to your third book is that if giving too much power to the central authority in terms of Aadhaar may give rise to an Orwellian kind of system where the big brother knows a lot about us, where governments would want us to take various different services on the Aadhaar network. Does it raise fears, of a big brother overarching, knowing everything and for everything being a single source of identity? And second, in terms of the identity fundamentally being allowed to fall into wrong places if one were to assume that the hackers were omnipresent at all points of time?
But you see, I'm glad you asked this question about the privacy and security of the issues, because this is the epilogue of my book, which was written before the Supreme Court judgment, argued strenuously for the need for data protection and a law on privacy. So the Supreme Court has given us the constitutional right to privacy, and government has committed to putting together a data protection law. Now, that's necessary, and I want to sort of make this point that the government doesn't really need Aadhaar to spy on you. There are 7, 8 different laws. I mean, the state, no matter which country you are, is omnipowerful. It is omnipotent. There's no doubt about it. Okay, so it's not going to. So the IT Act itself has enough. I mean, people post all kinds of stuff on social media, including the children. I'm always struck by people who post infants and children's pictures on social media. I don't know what their privacy consent form says, but so we share a lot of stuff in public. Indians are more sort of ready to part with information which is not asked for than anybody else. So the concerns were whether the encryption technology that was used, the biometric, because that's the only identity you have. If the biometric is lost, then what is? So secondary, third, tertiary, new identity systems could be created. So we followed fingerprint with retina. Now I'm told there are new other ways to identify a person. So yes, I worry about the power of the state to survey you, not exactly target you. if they want to, so rightly it was resisted that, connecting all the pieces would have given the state too much power. And so the privacy judgment of the Supreme Court sort of puts constraints on this. There are a lot of restraints have been placed. The thing is that how good a system is depends on us, on citizens, to push back, to ask, to argue, to reach out to the MPs, to write letters. And this is something that happened in the run-up to the Aadhaar thing, and I'm very glad that it had a robust resistance, and all some of the charges that were made were, even today, which are being made, it's people don't understand. For instance, there is this people crossing over from Nepal border were found in Bihar, and they found citizens of Nepal carrying Aadhaar cards. So I don't know how do you identify citizens of Nepal if they're carrying Aadhaar card. Whether, Nepal has the same question about citizenship, how to define citizenship that India has. So anyway, so the Aadhaar card does not bestow citizenship. Aadhaar card does not bestow you right to vote. Aadhaar card does not bestow anything. It is only an identity card. So all of us Indians who work abroad acquire a social security number. Does that make us citizens? We acquire driver's licenses. Does that make us so there is a misconception which probably was political, as if this card made you an Indian and not. So that misconception has stayed. And so it is much more critical to get these issues sorted. So the funny thing is the government uses Aadhaar whenever it hits a roadblock. So if you notice, if you want to apply for a passport or a voting card, of the 3 things out of 6 that you need to present, one is Aadhaar. The Supreme Court said that it should not be used for commercial purposes. So it was given as an option. How many people do you know who don't give their Aadhaar as to get a SIM card or a bank account? It's the easiest, most functional, so people do it. Now, there are countries in the world where your digital footprint is completely with the government. Okay, there are good examples and there are bad examples. So China is the one that you worry about. You should worry about how China monitors and surveys its citizens. Estonia, it's a completely just digital system. It is a former Soviet bloc country, but they've done it brilliantly. They vote electronically. They vote in remote. Everything is possible there. And that is possible because every time the government of Estonia touches their personal identity, it has to flash to them. It is told. They have rules. They have norms of declaration, purpose declaration, need declaration. So it's interesting. Where we are going is interesting. I remember going to Tokyo about 12 years back, and most Japanese people were just waving their phone biometric barcode at the train station to get the train or at the airport. Nobody was using a physical ticket. So that involves some amount of loss of privacy, I guess.
Absolutely right, Shankkar. And I think with new technologies like facial recognition, etc., coming in the next couple of years, I think we have a whole new world.
I know, Rajesh, in London, there is no place that is not covered by a CCTV in the city of London. It has probably the largest number of television cameras outside of Beijing in Shanghai.
Fascinating. So brave new world, we are already there. And I want to move to your third book. Okay, so The Gated Republic, which came out this year. And it sort of takes the story forward in a very different way. And what you're covering really here is that India, if it has to become a $5 trillion economy, it can't do so because of the sort of failures of the state in a way, in very core things: education, health, water, power, security. You've covered these 5 themes in the book. where people are basically being forced to opt in or forced to resort to private solutions. So the failure of public policy results in private solutions, and fascinating stories through the book. So what does this tell us about the Indian state? So on one side, we've got something as complex and as sort of powerful as Aadhaar, which is done. And yet some of the basic necessities of life, 75 years after independence, we are still not able to provide to a large percentage of the population.
So I mean, this was a question that struck me as to why we can't get it right and what is the issue. And so, as I said, Accidental India proved that change comes with crisis. Aadhaar proved that change can come without crisis, and Gated Republic proves that even when there is a crisis, there might not be change. So there is, so the necessary and sufficient condition rules apply here. So, in fact, I opened the book with this thing, with this thought which had been in my head that, I mean, so we are able to launch a Mars mission at a cost of what less than what it cost Hollywood to produce Gravity. We are able to do Kumbh Mela. We are able to conduct elections of 900 million people. And we are the largest, one of the largest space powers. We are a nuclear power. Indians sort of maintain the technology end of over half the Fortune 500 companies. So what's the thing? Why aren't we able to deliver on the most basic things? And so you see, I've lived in Mumbai, I've lived in Bangalore, I've lived in Delhi, I've lived in Pune. And every city has its own kind of contour of public services. When you're in Mumbai, you are very blessed because, you know, everything is sort of in place, and, you know, the electric grid is designed to island in Bombay off if there was a grid collapse. Water supply is consistently maintained. But, and this was my thought because I had also covered the city municipal corporation and state government, so I knew that Bombay was special. But over a period of time, I came to hear that suburbs didn't had power outages, water supply was an issue across the city. And so this thought kept coming back. And so I said, okay, so these are silent crises that I had mentioned actually in my first book, the Silent Crisis. So I said, let's look at why this is happening, and took quite a bit of research to sort of figure out any. I mean, so let's take health now, since we are still in the wake of the pandemic. India's first health report was commissioned by Florence Nightingale in 1850s. And you read that report, which came out 5 years later, it sounds like it was written in 2020. It has all the issues, the water, the sanitation, the availability of doctors, the availability of paramedics. You read the next big good report, Bore report, sorry. And that came out in 46. You read that, everything it says is valid today. So Florence Nightingale says that make hygiene the centerpiece of your health policy. 1856. And we are still talking about Swachh Bharat. So the education policy is the same story. We had midday meal schemes, so we were able to enroll children, but the quality of education, the outcomes are really bad. Now it's getting worse because the people have realized that a private school education certifies you a sort of jump start, gives you a jump start in the job market, or makes you better. People believe that private schools are better because government schools, 25% absenteeism, 25% vacancy. Half the teachers are not there. And so every government comes and has a story of how it's to be done. Take law and order. Bihar and Uttar Pradesh lead the tally in vacant police posts. Bihar and Uttar Pradesh are two states which desperately need law and order. One of the reasons nobody is investing there is the vulnerability, the optics of law and order. Water. We are still dealing with water as if we are a surplus nation. We are not. We have a population now that has to be managed. And we haven't had a real, so who uses the maximum water in India? Maximum water is used for agriculture. Next is industry, and third is people. Nearly 75 to 80% of the water is used for agriculture. We haven't had a decent attempt at a new crop map in 70 years. Not one attempt. And therefore, we grow sugarcane in drought hit areas of Maharashtra, paddy in Haryana, in Punjab, where water is being mined, whereas it should be grown in the Gangetic Plains, in Chhattisgarh, in other places. We use sugar cane to derive. I mean, we are the largest producers of sugar, but I mean, do we need to use sugar cane, which is like a water intensive crop? Why not use sugar beet? These are questions that we have never applied. The second part is when it comes to piped water, only 20% of India gets water in their homes. Can you imagine this? 70 years after independence, only 20% of India gets 25% now if you sort of add up some of the new additions. So what's the flaw there? We transferred the ownership of water and management of water from the communities to the government. So A, the management of water was nobody's responsibility. B, we thought that laying pipe from X to Z is the only way to deliver water. Now there are various ways to deliver water, potable water. The government of India now has a Jal Shakti ministry. And the government has promised that they will deliver piped water they will connect every home with pipes. So this is where I worry. When they say I will connect with pipes, I don't know whether the water will flow through or not. So, and I think again, they're making the same error of large project piping and all. Whereas every area has groundwater. Groundwater can be harnessed. We have membrane reverse osmosis technology. There are water ATMs functioning in the railway ministry, in various villages, philanthropic organizations. We have to harness private ideas to deliver these things. So the thing that when I was writing the book, one of the things that struck me was over a period of time, India centralized centralized the power to solve every problem that it could not solve. And by centralizing that system, they made it worse because water, electricity, healthcare, security are all last mile issues, which is the first mile of governance. And they should be managed at the local government level. So 93, 94, we passed the Panchayat, the 73rd, 4th Amendment to deliver rights to panchayats and municipalities. State governments still don't transfer it. Then we talk about decentralization. In international forum, Rajesh, we always tell UN, WTO, World Bank, and others that the world should not attempt one size fits all solutions. And yet, within India, we try one size fits solutions. We have a thing. So every time we centralize something, we make the problem worse. And I've been arguing this 1-point agenda that I have is let's decolonize governance. The center's stronghold over state governments, funds, functions, and the state government's stronghold and power over the next level of governance. And this is the one structural thing, that big issue we have. The second, and this is something to do with people, and so I don't know how this has come through, and I struggle with the answer for this as to why people, when they're, so at every income level, those who have a voice, who can say something, find an option and shift to the option. So every time they exit, the case for somebody fighting for the delivery of public services becomes weaker. And I often think, and I've said this publicly, so I don't mind saying this again, is I think Indians sort of practice democracy once in 5 years for a few hours when they go to vote. The rest of the time, they treat the government as a benign monarchy. So, okay, we voted these guys into place and let's see how they sort of pan out. And so, at one level, there is everybody's so caught up with their daily life that they're unable to deal with the extra obligation of being citizens or participants in a democracy. But a more important point, there is no forum left, whether in cities or states or in the national level, for a person with a concern to take his concern to a forum and have a public representative represent him on that cause. So MPs represent their, members of parliament and MLAs are elected on the Representation of People Act. They're supposed to represent their people, their constituents, but they're always representing the parties that they elected on. And so there is this deficit of governance, deficit of representation. So deficit of governance is basically deficit of participation, deficit of representation. So how we bring this together is going to be critical for India. No country, Rajesh, in the world, no country has come up without investing in human development. We speak so much about China, about it being authoritarian, blah, 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 and all that. But what does it say about the democracy that India is, that an authoritarian, totalitarian state, a communist state like China, beats India on every human development indicator, every human development indicator. I mean, it's shocking how smaller countries are doing much better than India. I mean, if we take state-wise thing, some of the states are in sub-Saharan region. Sorry, tell me.
I think, no, it's a great point. And I think there's a lot of food for thought. I think your book covers incredible ground. I think it's path-breaking in that sense in terms of what it covers.
Thank you, Rajesh.
And we've got a few minutes left, and I want to take up one more theme as we close out on, because you've been a great watcher and very perceptive through these last decades, and your books actually, like I said earlier, tells the story of India. What happens next? So what do you think is the next economy like?
So I think governments in India tend to be deluded that there is time to do things. That is the grand delusion. Or that we are already doing things. That is the grander delusion. The worst is that we have already done it. So when I look at the future, I mean, here's where we are in post the 9 months of the pandemic. We know that technology has accelerated, the adoption of technology. We know that countries are choosing to automate at a rapid pace to reconfigure their supply chains. We know that the investment and allocation of resources will be now governed by a new item called ESG, which is environment, sustainability, and governance. So this is what I call the new currency for you to get money, new qualification that you need to have. Some commentators have also said that this could be the new apartheid in the world of finance. But allocation of capital, how it comes to India, is going to be very critical. Okay, so there are three parts. There is a demographic story, which is the West is aging. Countries which will add the most number of people are poor in resource and poor in governance. Countries which will shrink in population have the resources to replace human beings with automation. Now you have demography, you have technology, and layer on top of that, climate. Climate change is not something that is happening at the pole. It's happening everywhere. I mean, so every year there's a rising sea level. Every year we know extreme weather. We know India's monsoon, for instance, has shifted by a month. We know it ends later and begins later. We know it's severe in its burst. We know we can't harness that water. What are we doing about it? Okay, A, climate. B, demographic change and the retrenchment of human beings by automation, digitization is visible. People who could get jobs as clerks in banks know that bank jobs are limited because ATMs have replaced tellers. Now ATMs are being replaced by apps. Now apps might be replaced by something else. So we don't know where this is headed. Okay. So what are the skills that we require to reconfigure our economy? And here's an interesting thing, and I'll be happy if somebody provides me with the answer. Every year I try to find this, how many graduates passed out of colleges in India. So you get the number for the technical colleges, but you get an approximation for all the other colleges. So we produce 52 or 56,000 MBBS graduates, medical graduates. We produce about 3 lakh engineers. We produce X number of chartered accountants, but we don't know how many graduates in science we produce. We don't know how many diploma holders we produce. We don't know how many commerce graduates. There is no number. So here's the beginning of the skill conundrum. If you don't know how many graduate, what are the skill levels? How are you going to skill them for the next economy? People who say that technology will not replace human beings, but actually is complementary, must recognize that there is an element of inverse Luddite thinking in that. Technology will retrench people. It may create jobs elsewhere, but are your people ready for those jobs? Is your system ready for the jobs? For instance, climate change and the need to sort of shrink the fossil fuel economy means India must shrink its footprint of usage of coal. Now, Coal India employs 270,000 people. What are you going to do about that? Do we have an income support scheme? Do we have an alternate employment scheme? What do we have ready for that? So the public policy is yet to evolve on that. It's yet to evolve on climate. So we sort of think that climate means let's park 4 or 5 more solar projects. I mean, okay, so it helps the footprint of which form of electricity you use, but you still 40% on coal. The second part is that solar also consumes a lot of space. A solar power project, 1 megawatt is to 5 acres or something is the ratio. Okay. India is a land constrained country. So we have to think about this differently. So can we say so we have national highways, there was island space in national highways. Why not have lease that space between the 2 lanes of the national highway to people who want to set up solar plants and have a high mass solar? I've explained this 3 times to different people in government. It's not gone through as yet. Either I'm a bad communicator or they're bad listeners. I don't know which one is the truth. We have the largest coastline, over 7,000 kilometers of border and coastline. So what are we doing about that coastline? Why can't we have power projects on barrage? Why can't we have windmills, offshore windmills? Why aren't we thinking? Okay, to be frank, all of these have issues of cost and economics and all. But I only wish that we discuss these things much more robustly than we discuss love jihad and stuff like that. I mean, we have so much time for what's happening, what is not happening, but very little time for what is happening.
I think very well put, Shankkar, I think, and these are the questions which are, I think, going to define the decade and the next, probably 20, 30 years for the young population that India is. I mean, these are probably the best years for India to move from the penury that you talked about earlier to prosperity. But it's been a fascinating conversation. I think so much food for thought, and I think I'm eagerly looking forward to your new book. And I think the one good thing which you always, of course, have done is not just lay out the problems, but give innovative solutions backed by data and examples.
Hey, but Rajesh, I'm a Bombay wala. I think of the solution first.
It's been a great conversation. I think it was a wonderful tour through India's own history. I think through your writings, and I think over to you, Jaimit. What do you think?
I think it's interesting, and when I'm speaking to Shankkar and I'm looking at some of our hippobrains who've been on our shows before, and Akhilesh who argues about the private cost of public failure, or Ajay Shah who explained that we have a small window for to take our demographic dividend and use it for better. I think he said, Rajesh, if I'm not mistaken, we have till 2035 before we probably end up wasting it. Or Ramesh, who talks about taking a lot of people out of poverty by getting them into skilled manufacturing. Or lastly, Shruti, who talks about why it is all the central planning has altered the very basic fabric of the constitution that stops us from doing any of this. And now we have Shankkar who's talking about, ye sab chodo, all you need is a bloody crisis. And if you have a crisis that is good enough, we have all the answers. And if you have the crisis, Indian politicians will figure out what to do, like they have done in the past. And by an accidental problem or some level of politics, we got Aadhaar because the answer was in some way known to us. We got probably accidentally, I don't know how, the right person for the right job. And today you have something that can give us a huge way to take it forward. And finally, about the gated republic, where it probably brings home to fact that people like you and me, Rajesh, or even I would argue, Shankkar, that we live in cities, we have access to a lot of facilities. We don't really understand or value the role of government, where I think some of our hippobrains in the past have argued that the role of the government is to ensure a far equitable distribution and not just necessarily rely that the private enterprise will ensure distribution for what essentially the government wants. I think Shankkar helps us understand a lot of these nuances. Shankkar helps us open our eyes to all of it. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Shankkar, for being a great author, columnist, and a speaker right now, and a guest on hippobrain. And thank you for being with us.
It's a privilege to be a hippobrain.
Thank you, Shankkar. And to all our viewers and listeners, to subscribe to us, you can press subscribe, and you get informed of all these brilliant hippobrain conversations that we're having. And you can get us on any of your podcast channels. Thanks a lot. Do see you again.